Hi, my name's Kristen, and my group and I will be discussing increasing on-task behaviors. Within my group, I have my other group members, Bara, Val, Carl, Kristen, and Audrey Witta.
So self-monitoring refers to the act of observing and tracking one's own behavior based on a specific criteria. It's a relatively easy and effective way of keeping students on task in a proactive way, which should always be the goal in a classroom. Historically, auditory buzzers were used, which can be very distracting for other students in the classroom. Therefore, students often had to wear headphones, which were intrusive, and it singled out the kids in need of the intervention, which made it impractical and restrictive. Luckily, with advances in technology and the use of cell phones and apps, self-monitoring has become a much more appealing option. With apps such as Motivator and Watchminder available, students receive a silent vibration, also known as a tactile prompt. Because it is silent, it can be used without bringing any attention to the student. These apps are inexpensive and widely available, which makes self-monitoring a really appealing intervention for many. Due to these factors, there's a really high treatment acceptability. Numerous studies have been examining the benefits of self-monitoring for students with very positive results. One study by Amadozek and her colleagues found that students increased on-task behavior from about 55% to more than 90%. And these results are not atypical. However, nearly all of the studies that have been done on self-monitoring have used participants with disabilities, and very few have studied the effects of self-monitoring in regular education classrooms with typically developing students. So in 2013, Moore and his colleagues conducted a study of 3 high school students with varying abilities, but all were in regular education courses. Our study aimed to replicate the results found by Moore.
Moore and others ultimately wanted to look at off-task behaviors, which tend to lead to inattentiveness within a classroom. They also noticed that students tend to fail within handing in work assignments and other things related to school. There are also long-term effects on instructional processes in schools when this happens, when off-task behaviors are pretty high. Moore and others also wanted to look at the self-management system, as Val mentioned, which is the personal application of behavior change tactics that produce desired results. Overall, there's not much data with general ed classrooms. Most of the studies conducted on-task behaviors tend to involve individuals with disabilities. They also wanted to look at the difference between audio prompts and tactile prompts. Audio prompts are when there's a beeper or a buzz, which might be more intrusive within a classroom setting. So Moore and others decided to use a tactile prompt, which is the Motivator app. The study conducted used 3 male participants with high levels of off-task behavior. They observed these students within regularly scheduled classrooms, and they didn't really alter their environments at all. They tried to do this in the natural environment with their baseline data and their intervention phases as well. Their dependent variable focused on task behaviors, which were writing, reading, interacting with the teacher in any positive manner, such as walking up to the teacher, asking for questions, raising hands, etc. Moore and others then took baseline data and ensured that they had inter-observer agreement data across 25% of those sessions. For the intervention phase, they used the Motivator app, which is essentially like a phone. We could download it on our phone, and the students had it next to them in their desk, in their classroom, and it would go off every 3 minutes to where they record on the self-recording sheet whether or not they were on task or not. Overall, this study showed positive results and an increase in on-task behaviors. Also, the on-task behaviors tended to generalize to other lessons within the school as well.
The purpose of the current study was to replicate and expand on previous findings of Moore et al. More specifically, we explored the efficacy of self-monitoring using a tactile prompt with the Motivator app on task behavior. Monitoring on-task behavior can be extremely useful within the academic setting for grad school students as well. Thus, the current study looked to see how effective utilizing this tactile beeper would be on increasing our own on-task behavior. Since the previous study by Moore looked into its performance of generalization of high school students, we felt that it was important to see its effects on higher level of education and within different settings.
For the methods part, the participants of our study projects were 5. They were all females except for 1 male, and they were all enrolled in Ball State graduate program in ABA with emphasis in autism. The age range was between 25 and 37. The study, all the observation study were conducted while studying for the class of the applied behavior analysis. Study session lasted for about 30 minutes, and they included watching videos, independent work and assignments, discussion boards, studying for tests, and so on. The materials used included our own phones to download the Motivator application. The application generally delivers a vibration on predetermined time intervals. We used the self-monitoring data sheets to collect data during baseline. It showed the 30-minute session divided into 120 intervals. Each interval constitutes of 15 seconds with a box of a Y letter, which indicates a yes to being on-task behavior and a no to indicate off-task behaviors. The same self-monitoring sheet was used, but with intervals up to 3 minutes for the intervention phase. We also used our own computers to record ourselves during our study sessions, and all of our data was graphed on a cumulative line graph sheet. For the behavior definitions, mainly in our study project, we had 2 main behaviors of concern. First, it was the on-task behavior, and the second is the off-task behavior. For the on-task behaviors, our definition was that it's any behavior that is related to achieving the task we had in hand. This could include typing, writing, reading, or watching the assigned videos. On the other hand, the off-task behaviors were defined as engaging in any behavior other than the target task. This could be like looking at your own phone, looking away from the target task, doodling, drawing, singing, or talking to someone else in the room that is not related to the task in hand. And it could be any other behavior other than the above mentioned. For our data collection, we used momentary time sampling, which means that we record ourselves during our 30-minute session study, and then we use the self-monitoring data sheets to fill in the data every 15 seconds. For the intervention phase, we used the same thing. We only that what's different that the time interval was about 3 minutes instead of 15 seconds. In case it was hard for us to discriminate between on-task and off-task behavior, it was hard for us to, or 2 of the behaviors happened simultaneously, we recorded it as an off-task behavior. The design of the study project, to replicate the original study, we used the same design, which is a multiple baseline design. This design will help us to examine the effects of the intervention we had compared to the several participants. For the baseline and for the treatment phases, each participant had to record themselves during the study session for at least 3 hours or until the data is stable. And then another group member was randomly assigned to watch 3 random sessions of another group member to collect the baseline data as well. There were no consequences applied for the off-task behavior during baseline. For the treatment phase, we used the Motivator application during our study sessions. This will deliver a vibration each 3 minutes. And by that time, we will fill up the self-monitoring sheet with a circle on either yes or no to indicate if we were on task during when the motivator vibrated. At the end of each session, we all charted our data on a cumulative line graph. There were no consequences applied for the off-task behaviors during the treatment phase as well, or the intervention phase. For the IOEA, The participants were randomly assigned to watch 25% of the videos, recordings of another participant. These videos were baseline recordings, and this helped us to calculate our inter-observer agreements for the occurrence of on-task behavior. It was on an interval-by-interval basis, which means that the formula we used is to calculate the agreements, dividing it on the agreements and the total number of disagreements as well, and then multiplied by 100.
So these graphs display some of the results of the study that we found. There are 5 graphs in total. Here you see 3 of them. And so at the very top, you see Val's graph of her behavior. So she was the one who initially recorded 4 sessions of baseline before intervention portion. So with her baseline, we saw that it was slightly variable, decreasing. Her, once she jumped to intervention, we saw an increase in her on-task behavior. So after she completed 4 baseline, Audrey completed another 4 baseline before I transitioned to the intervention phase. Although I saw an increase in on-task behavior, even during my baseline phase, the data just continued to increase, and although it varied slightly, the overall average of the behavior was higher in interventions. After I transitioned to the intervention phase, then I believe, let's see, I believe it was Bara who then started the intervention phase. And she found, see at the end, that her on-task behavior remained at the intervention phase for the last several. So here you see the last 2 portions of the graph. So at the top here, you see Kristen's, and she started her intervention phase. I believe that would be 16 after her initial baseline. And hers was slightly different than the rest of us saw because her data was relatively stable throughout the whole thing. So even though she was in the high 90% of on-task behavior, even during baseline, it still saw a slightest increase during her intervention. And lastly, you see Carl's data, which he was the one who was in the baseline phase the longest. And his was also the most variable in the baseline phase. But as you can see from this graph, once he transitioned to the treatment phase, then his data became stable as well at 100% even. So another part of the results section we wanted to display the range of percentages of on-task behavior that we saw in the baseline and intervention phases of this study. So as you can see, Val during baseline, her range was between 79 and 96%. And you can see these names in order that we transitioned to the intervention phase. So Val had the least amount of baseline and the most amount of intervention, whereas Carl had the most baseline and the least amount of intervention. So Val had that 79 to 96 in her initial 4 baseline sessions, whereas during intervention, she ranged between 70 to 100%. To point out that I think it's interesting that there are 3 of the 5 of us during the baseline section who got to 100% at some point. But when you look at the intervention percentages, all of us got at least 100% on-task behavior once during this study. So you can see, with my name being next, during the baseline, the range of the on-task behavior during the sessions was 78 to 100%, and during intervention, the range was between 80 to 100%. Range during baseline was 70 to 96.6%, and during the intervention was 70 to 100%. Baseline was 93 to 100%, and during intervention was 98 to 100%. And Carl's during baseline was 75 to 100% on task behavior, and during intervention, we saw 90% to 100% on task behavior. What I think is interesting is to not only look at the range of these baseline and intervention phases, but also to look at the average percentages of each. And so when you look at the table, there are the baseline phase is at the top row, and then the bottom row is the intervention average. And if you look across, you can see that every person had a higher percentage of on-task intervention phase, which I think really says something positive about the results of this study. So Val, during her baseline, had an average of 86.8%. Intervention, it was 91.5% on task. So with her, we saw around a 5% jump between baseline and intervention. During baseline, my average was 90.9% on task behavior, whereas during intervention, it was 94.4% on. So again, we see another significant increase. I think that was about. And then with Bara, we see another large increase, even larger than the one before, where during baseline, she was at 97.5% on-task behavior on average. And then during the intervention phase, she was at an average of 95% on-task behavior. And so with her, we saw approximately 7% baseline to the intervention phase. Now moving on to Kristen's data, she was the one who was relatively stable throughout the study. So in the baseline phase, she had an average of 95.9% on-task behavior, and the intervention we saw an increase to 99.4% on-task behavior. And so even though her data have increased, it was the most stable, and it was at the highest percentage at first. Moving on to Carl's data, and I think here is where we saw the highest increase from baseline to the intervention. So during baseline, average of 86% on task behavior, and then in the intervention phase, he showed a 97.5% on task behavior. And so there we see a 13 to 14% increase, which is huge. So especially for students who might, like Carl, have some of those study habits where they could really benefit from some self-monitoring, things like this study could be really beneficial.
And then I believe it goes to Bara to discuss the treatment integrity of our study.
To ensure our treatment integrity, we used the recorded sessions videos to serve as a permanent product. This way we can go back to them to ensure that we actually got the data correctly, and it will help us in any future problems, if they had to be problems, by referring back to them. During our weekly group meetings, we had like to revise the definitions of the on-task and the off-task behaviors. We also discussed and gave example on both of them in case any member had questions about what might be an example of an on-task behavior or what might be not an example. We had to brainstorm and go back to our definitions, and then we could come up with decisions collectively.
So each participant's average percentage of on-task behavior increased from baseline phase to the intervention phase. So although there was an increase in this percentage of on-task behavior, a statistical analysis would have needed to be done to see if the results were significant. Based on the study's results, though, of self-monitoring strategies, such as using the Motivator app, we can determine from this that it could be an effective intervention for increasing on-task behavior of graduate students as well as other students. The findings of this also corroborate the results found by Moore, supporting the effectiveness of self-monitoring strategies through the use of tactile prompts. So going over some of the limitations of our study, some of them actually were some of the same limitations that Moore had also found. So to start with, lack of generalization data discussed by Moore, since only we were specifically looking at increasing our on-task behavior of study habits, there's no account for if the effects of this study actually carried over into other classes or actually increased our any other outcomes other than just on-task behavior. So with this, additionally, due to some time constraints and other factors, follow-up sessions were not completed to note if there was any lasting effects on, on us as a group for our on-task behaviors. And future studies should actually consider a long-term effects of self-recording through tactile prompting. Another limitation that we had found within the current study were the methods in which video recording was completed. So with some of us, we, since we're just trying to naturally record ourselves studying, which I'll kind of touch base on here in just a second as another limitation, some of us put the camera off to our side. Some of us had the camera, like myself, facing straight on. So it kind of became difficult to see exactly what task we were working on, if we were working on, an actual, a task that would be, considered actually studying. And if it was a view from the side, it was harder to see exactly where eye gaze was. So although if you had like a front-on view, you could tell where the eye gaze was, you couldn't really see the subject in which they were looking at. But from a side view, you could see what subject they were looking at, but it was extremely difficult to see exactly where their eye gaze was actually at, if it was on task at all. And so kind of going back to us being recorded, observer reactivity. So since, it's not exactly a very common thing to just sit and record yourself studying, especially for myself, for hours on end, and then going back and looking through that, it's one of those things where, although, towards the end for myself, I felt more comfortable, most of us felt, you are being recorded, you're being recorded. And so therefore, it kind of changes your behavior on actually staying on task. And, it could either have a positive or a negative effect of how you stay on task, knowing that you are recording. And then lastly, as Moore also describes, is that within our study too, we lack records of academic performance following the study. So we have no knowledge of whether or not there was an increase in performance due to us using the Motivator app to stay and take note of whether or not we were on task. So no matter what class we were studying for at the time, it's extremely difficult to kind of record that and then see and compare as to how you were doing academically during the time for baseline versus actual intervention. And they more suggests adding informal measures to account for functional workloads and defining task completion and achievement. And I would agree that, you know, in future research, there definitely needs to be a way of actually recording whether or not like the performance area is there for the on-task behavior. And that wraps up our limitation section.
Then listed are all of the references used for our study and the introduction section. And then we're each going to go around and discuss our reflections from the project. So for myself in particular, I think that this replication project definitely helped overall in my studying skills, because I definitely had to schedule certain times to record myself. So I think that that helped, and I actually got a lot more homework done within a shorter time period than I might have originally. I think that, as Carl mentioned, a definite limitation of the study was that I knew I was being recorded. I don't think that I ever got away from that, because I used my MacBook so I could see the little green light, so that was a difficult part. But I think that overall the study helped, and I actually enjoyed doing it, and I think all of my group members really worked well together and kind of discussing what's happening next and just furthering ourselves within this class. Thanks.
So I'm Val. I was the first to go through from baseline to the intervention phase. Because I only recorded four sessions, I was definitely aware of the video recording, and I never was able to get away from that. So I don't know how in our situation we would be able to go away to do things differently, given that we live very far apart. But that was definitely a limitation of our study. As far as the intervention phase, I was surprised. I was concerned going in that having something buzzing at me every 3 minutes would actually take me off task. But it was actually so simple to just check yes or no that it really didn't take me off task too much. What I did find was, I don't know that it necessarily made it so that I was not off task, but I certainly was off task for less amount of time. So it very well might have been that I would be off task without the motivator and might be off task for 15 minutes at a time. In this situation, because, you know, I knew that thing buzzed at 3 minutes, it got me back on task and brought me back around to focusing again. So I found that to be a rather interesting surprise, because I really thought that it would not have an effect on me, honestly. But it did manage to make sure that even if I got off task and kind of fell away from it, it brought me back all the time. So I certainly found it helpful. And overall, it was a good, interesting study. Doing the IOA data was certainly interesting to watch our fellow colleagues here studying, and but we did it by the book, and we followed the study as similarly as we could, and I think we did a good job with it.
Hello, this is Bara. So, as my classmates mentioned, I think I never got off the idea that I was being recorded, which I think was both negative and positive, because although I always felt the urge of leaving the task and getting to go and refresh, I always thought like it's only a 30-minute session and I can do it and just stick to it. So although this was the positive side of it, I think the negative side that this might give us or myself a false sense of achievement, because really the only reason I was pushing myself to do it is because I'm being recorded. So although I felt like it really helped me to finish the session with being on task. It was, my motivation was rather than being on task and doing it, is to prove to myself that I can stay on it for the whole 30-minute session while it's being recorded. The positive thing that I have noticed later on is that even after the intervention stopped and now I'm just studying, I found myself checking my phone and actually realizing that I have stayed for past 30 minutes that I used to pass like with really hard time. So I think after even the intervention stopped, I picked up the habit of staying on task for about 30 minutes. So I think that's the only good thing that resulted from this intervention on myself. And the negative thing was about me actually having to sit down and being there on task for the pure motivation of me being recorded. So other than this, it was like a really nice experience because we all had to learn about all of our habits and get to know how much we can actually do in a 30-minute session if we actually just sat down and do what we had to do. Thank you.
Hi. I would agree that there were several positive things that came from this study as far as staying on task for longer periods of time and just having a better awareness of what I was doing and where my attention was at any given point. I will say that one thing that I personally wish was a little bit different were just the technology part of this. I think that this study could have been made a lot more efficient had there been a second person observing us as we completed whatever activity we were doing. Since we had to record ourselves and then watch it back again, there was that extra technological piece that I personally had some difficulty with. So I know for me, I started off recording the videos on the computer, and those didn't record properly, so I ended up recording on my phone. And I wonder if that's an additional limitation for my data personally, because I know that as I'm studying, my phone is typically my biggest distractor. And so when you look at my data, towards the end, it gets to be more on task behavior because I don't have that distraction. And so I just wonder how the results would have changed or if they would have been different had I not had those initial technological difficulties. But I would say overall, it was a positive experience working with my group and collaborating, talking about the results of our study. And I was very productive in the time that I was recording myself. And I think that could have been because I was so aware of the fact that I was being recorded. So while that's a limitation, it did affect my behavior positively, I believe. And so overall, I think it was a great experience.
Hi, so I'm Carl Jaskew, and like most of my group members have already talked about, the knowing that I was being recorded. That was kind of more of an issue with me as well, especially knowing that later on in the going back, I'd have to rewatch myself studying. So since I had the longest, I was in baseline for the longest. I had to watch myself studying for a very, very long time, and Val actually was the one who had to watch me study for 2.5 hours of that time, and got to know me very well. So with that kind of, the relations and stuff that built with the group partners and things like that was really awesome, and I really enjoyed working together with everyone. And I definitely think overall it was a great experience going through this project. And even though like Audrey talked about, it would have been nice if there was another observer there, so then that way we didn't have to go back and watch ourselves. And then she faced the issue with the technical difficulties and of the recording. It would have made it a lot better and a lot more easily going through. But I definitely think with what we were able to do in the amount of time that we did this entire project, and I think we did a really, really good job. And definitely with any difficulties or anything like that, you know, we all did really, really well working together. And it was it honestly was a lot of fun at times, you know, going through some stressful times, but mostly fun, you know, getting to know everyone, and then, you know, kind of plugging through on the project. I definitely think going forward, you know, for me, as you could kind of see within the average of my baseline and then the average going into the actual treatment phase, you see a pretty big decrease. And I think a lot of that did have to do with, though, with knowing I was recorded within, because I would record myself for long, you know, sessions at a time. And so I think initially for those 30-minute segments in the beginning, I was recording myself. I'd kind of, you know, be more in a rhythm to continue to be on task. And then as it got further and further along, I'd kind of tend to not forget, but be like, well, I have to go do this real quick. You know, I can get back in like 30 seconds and hurry off camera and try to do that real quick. And so I think that definitely kind of affected my overall baseline data to a point. And then once reaching the actual intervention phase, it was so different for me at that point that, you know, to stay on task for that shorter duration of time was a lot easier for me. And so it ended up going, I ended up staying on task a lot longer. And, you know, I definitely think there's more research to be done within this section, but, you know, I really enjoyed working with everybody and really enjoyed, you know, kind of going through and kind of checking on my study habits and getting some work done. So, but I believe this concludes our group project. And we want to thank everyone who watches our video and hope you guys had a good group project as well. And, you know, good luck towards the end of the semester and take care, everyone.